I hung up eventually and sat with the quiet of the lake a long while, and then I picked the phone back up and called Priya and told her I needed to have a very different kind of conversation with Preston Calloway before the retreat contract went any further, and she asked, carefully, if everything was all right, and this time I told her the truth. Chapter 13. The city didn't fit anymore. Preston Calloway took the call from his office in the city, and I took it from the porch of the lake house, because it felt important, in a way I couldn't have fully explained to Priya if she'd asked, that I have this particular conversation, from exactly the place where I'd failed to have it the first time. Kamari, he said, jovial, already halfway into some story about the retreat catering, and I let him get about a minute into it before I cut in, more gently than I'd cut into. Anything in years, but with the same underlying precision I'd once turned on Aldrich's crew over a load-bearing beam. Preston, I need to say something about the other week, and I need you to actually hear it, rather than just wait for me to finish. He went quiet, surprised, the specific quiet of a man used to being the one who redirects conversations, rather than the one redirected. The man you called my handyman is named Maverick Reyes, I said. I hung up eventually and sat with the quiet of the lake a long while, and then I picked the phone back up and called Priya and told her I needed to have a very different kind of conversation with Preston Calloway before the retreat contract went any further, and she asked, carefully, if everything was all right, and this time I told her the truth. Chapter 13. The city didn't fit anymore. Preston Calloway took the call from his office in the city, and I took it from the porch of the lake house, because it felt important, in a way I couldn't have fully explained to Priya if she'd asked, that I have this particular conversation, from exactly the place where I'd failed to have it the first time. Kamari, he said, jovial, already halfway into some story about the retreat catering, and I let him get about a minute into it before I cut in, more gently than I'd cut into. Anything in years, but with the same underlying precision I'd once turned on Aldrich's crew over a load-bearing beam. Preston, I need to say something about the other week, and I need you to actually hear it, rather than just wait for me to finish. He went quiet, surprised, the specific quiet of a man used to being the one who redirects conversations, rather than the one redirected. The man you called my handyman is named Maverick Reyes, I said. He's the reason that property is still standing at all, and he is, without exaggeration, one of the most talented photographers I have ever seen work. And he is also, as of a month ago, someone I'm building a life with, which makes him my partner, not my staff, and not a punchline about local ladies. When you made that joke, I laughed along with it instead of correcting you, because it was convenient in the moment, and because some old, well-practiced part of me still calculates the cost of being fully myself in front of people whose approval, I've decided, matters to my business. I've decided that calculation isn't one I'm willing to keep running. I wanted you to hear that directly from me, not secondhand. And I wanted you to know that if the retreat contract requires me to keep being someone I'm not around your team, I'd genuinely rather lose the contract. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I braced myself for the version of this conversation where I actually did lose the retreat, and found, somewhat to my surprise, that I meant what I'd said enough to be at peace with that outcome. Kamari, Preston said finally, and his voice had lost its easy joviality, replaced by something more careful. I didn't know. Look, I made a stupid joke, the kind of joke I've been making my whole life without thinking twice about it. And I'm not going to pretend that's an excuse, because you just told me plainly it isn't one. I'm sorry. Genuinely. Not because you're my architect and I need this retreat to go well, though I'd be lying if I said that thought didn't cross my mind for half a second, but because you just told me something real about your life, and I clearly haven't been the kind of man people feel safe telling that to. And that's on me to fix, not you. A pause. The retreat's still happening, if you still want it. I'd like to actually meet him properly next time, buy him a drink, apologize myself, if he'll let me. I hadn't expected that, and I sat with it for a moment, surprised by how much easier the whole conversation had been than the 21 years of anticipatory dread I'd built up around ever having it. I drove back to the city 2 days later, not because I'd given up on Cedar Lake, but because there were things I needed to do there that couldn't be done from a porch 4 hours away, and the drive down felt different than any drive I'd made in years. Not lighter, Exactly. There was too much unresolved for lighter, but clearer, the specific clarity of a man who has finally stopped negotiating with himself about which parts of his life get to be real. I walked into the Solane offices on a Tuesday and told my leadership team, plainly, in the same conference room where I'd once corrected Denny's ceiling heights with surgical precision, that I was gay, that I'd been in a relationship for the last month with a man named Maverick Reyes, and that I would appreciate everyone's professionalism about it going forward in exactly the same way I'd appreciate their professionalism about anything else in my personal life, which is to say, minimal commentary and maximum competence. I watched a room full of people I'd worked alongside for years absorb the information with a range of reactions from mild surprise to visible relief. Priya, I found out later, had suspected for years and had simply been waiting, with a patience I hadn't earned, for me to decide I trusted the room enough to say it myself. Nobody in that office treated me differently afterward, except in the small, specific way that people occasionally gently ask after Maverick now the way they used to ask after nothing at all. And I understood, walking back to my own office that afternoon, that I had spent 2 decades bracing for a catastrophe that had simply never been waiting for me on the other side of the door, and that the only person who had ever really made me pay for who I was had been myself, charging interest on a debt nobody else had ever actually billed me for. But none of that mattered. Not really, not yet, because the person whose opinion of all this actually mattered most hadn't answered a single one of my calls in 6 days, and the city, for the first time since I'd built my whole life inside it, felt like the wrong place to be standing while I waited to find out if he ever would. I packed a bag on Thursday night. I did not call ahead. I understood, somewhere in the drive north, that showing up unannounced was itself part of the point, that I owed him, after everything, the specific inconvenience of being seen trying, in person, at an actually difficult moment, rather than managing the whole reconciliation carefully from a safe distance, the way I'd have managed it a month before. Chapter 14. Driving Back. It was raining again when I got there. The same steady, unhurried rain, from the night he'd first told me about the bill he'd paid for being loud. And I remember thinking, pulling up the gravel road in the dark with my headlights catching the tree line, that the weather in this place seemed to know exactly when to underline a moment. His truck wasn't at the little house at the edge of town. I'd driven past it first, some old instinct telling me not to trust that he'd simply be waiting at the lake house for me, which turned out to be right. And I found it eventually parked at the boathouse on Elias's property, which he still, I understood now, thought of as partly his even though nothing on paper said so, and which I had started to think of the same way myself. He was on the dock. Of course he was on the dock. I'd learned, over 1 month, that the dock was where Maverick Reyes went to think about things too large to think about anywhere else, and I stood at the top of the path for a moment in the rain, watching him sit with his knees drawn up, looking out at water he couldn't possibly see clearly in the dark and the wet. And I understood that whatever I said next needed to actually mean something, needed to be the opposite of the small, easy, professional laugh that had cost us both this whole terrible week. I told my mother, I said, coming down the path, not bothering to raise my voice over the rain, close enough now that I didn't need to. On the phone, 4 days ago. Told her I'm gay, told her about you, told her I was done being careful about it. She said she's known since I was 16. Said she and my father were cowards about it and let me build a whole life around never having to say it, and that she was sorry it hadn't been easier for me. I kept walking, slow, giving him every chance to tell me to stop. I told my leadership team on Tuesday, all of them, in the same room where I once made a junior associate cry over ceiling heights. I told Preston Calloway, directly, that the joke he made wasn't funny and that you're not my staff, you're my partner, and that I'd rather lose his contract than keep laughing along at your expense. He apologized. Wants to buy you a drink and apologize himself if you'll let him. Maverick hadn't turned around yet, but I could see, even from behind, that he'd gone very still, listening. None of that undoes what I did on that porch, I said, close now, close enough to sit down beside him if he let me, though I didn't yet, not until I'd said the rest of it. I know that. I'm not telling you all this because I think it even some ledger, like the invoice, paid in full plus interest. I'm telling you because you were right that night. There's no perfect moment where being seen becomes safe. You just have to decide to be seen anyway, at the actually inconvenient moment. And I didn't decide that when it mattered most, in front of you. And I am not going to spend the rest of whatever this is between us waiting for a more comfortable moment to keep choosing it. I've already started. I'll keep choosing it in every room from now on. The boardroom, the bonfire, my mother's kitchen table, wherever it needs choosing, for as long as you'll let me be someone worth choosing it for. He turned around then, finally, rain running down his face, and I couldn't tell, in the dark, how much of the wet on his face was only rain, and I decided it didn't matter which it was. "I've been sitting out here every night since," he said, quiet, rough. Telling myself I was right to ask for space. And I was right, I don't take that back. But I kept catching myself hoping you'd come find me anyway, at the actually inconvenient time, in the rain, without calling first, and hating myself a little for hoping it. Because I promised myself a long time ago I wasn't going to be somebody who waits around for a person to finally decide he's worth the trouble. He looked at me for a long moment, something raw and unguarded and frightened all at once in his face. "You're here in the rain, without calling first." "I am." "Say the part again, about choosing it in every room." "I'll keep choosing it," I said, "in every room, for as long as you'll have me." And this time when I sat down next to him on the wet dock boards, he didn't move away, and after a moment his hand found mine in the dark, careful at first, and then not careful at all. The same way the kiss at the bonfire had gone from careful to something entirely unguarded, and we sat there in the rain for a long time, not saying much else, because I think we'd both said the parts that actually mattered, and the rest could wait for drier ground. "I'm still scared," he said eventually, quiet, honest, his head resting against my shoulder, rain soaking through both of us equally now. "That doesn't go away just because you said the right things tonight. I've had people say the right things before, and then go quiet again the first time it actually cost them something." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking you to stop being scared. I'm asking you to let me keep proving it anyway, for as long as it takes, in as many actually inconvenient rooms as it takes, until scared stops being the only thing you feel when you think about trusting me with this." He didn't answer that with words. He turned his head and kissed me, slow, rain-wet, unhurried, the kind of kiss that isn't asking a question anymore. And somewhere out on the black water, a fish broke the surface, a small distant sound. And I remember thinking that I had spent 35 years organizing an entire life around never once being this exposed, sitting soaked to the skin on a dock in the dark with a man who had every reason not to trust me, and that I had never in all that careful, precise, well-defended life felt anything close to as right as I felt in that exact, thoroughly inconvenient moment. Chapter 15, What the Lake Gave Back. I never did call Odette about the listing. I think I want to tell that part plainly, without much drama around it, because by the time the question would have naturally come up again, a month after the rain on the dock, then 2, then 3, it had simply stopped being a real question at all. Odette called once, in early autumn, to ask, in the careful voice of a woman who has learned not to assume anything about her client's plans, whether I wanted her to draft the paperwork before the season turned, and I told her no, that I'd decided to keep the house. And she said, "Good," with more warmth than I expected from a woman I mostly knew through billing statements, and that was the entire end of that particular thread of my old life. What I did instead, over the following months, was something I had never once done with any property. In 9 years of designing them for other people, I asked the person who knew the place best what it actually needed, and I listened. "The boathouse," Maverick said, the first time I asked him, straightforward, like he'd been turning the answer over for longer than he was letting on. "Not for boats. Nobody's kept a boat in there in 15 years. It's just been storage and a place for me to leave the level I keep forgetting. Good light in the mornings. North-facing window on the east wall lets in the kind of light you actually want for developing, if you ever put a proper darkroom in, or just for shooting indoors on the bad weather days. It's the right size. It's always been the right size. I just never let myself think about it as anything but somebody else's shed. We rebuilt it together, that autumn and into the following spring, and I want to say honestly that I have designed hotel lobbies with bigger budgets and smaller amounts of care than went into that boathouse. 400 square feet of reclaimed cedar and good north light. A proper darkroom in the back corner. Wide plank flooring salvaged from a barn 2 towns over that Pete helped us track down. A wall of shelving Maverick built himself, slower than a contractor would have built it, because he wanted to get the joinery right the way he got everything right, quietly, without needing anyone to watch him do it. I did the drawings myself, evenings, at the kitchen table, and I remember the specific pleasure of designing something for exactly one person's actual life instead of an imagined client's imagined ideal of a life. A pleasure I hadn't let myself feel in years of building glass boxes. For people who wanted to be envied more than they wanted to be comfortable. He had his first show that following autumn, a small gallery 2 towns over that Wren, of all people, tracked down and badgered into giving him a wall, and I watched him stand in front of 40 of his own photographs hung properly, matted and framed, lit the way work like his deserved to be lit, greeting strangers who wanted to talk to him about his own eye, his own choices, his own particular way of seeing a lake or a pair of shelling hands, or the specific gray light of an early morning, and I watched the careful vigilance that had lived behind his eyes since the night I met him. Ease, not disappear. I don't think it will ever fully disappear. Some things don't, but ease into something that looked almost like permission he was finally giving himself. "You built this," he said to me quietly, at the edge of the gallery, watching Ruthie interrogate a stranger about whether they intended to actually buy the print they were admiring or just look at it for free. "I built a boathouse," I said. "You built everything that's hanging on these walls. I just gave the work somewhere decent to live." "Same thing you did for me then," he said, and didn't explain further, and didn't need to. My mother came up for Thanksgiving that year, the first Thanksgiving I had ever spent somewhere that wasn't defined by careful omissions, and I watched her sit at Elias's old kitchen table, our kitchen table now. I'd started thinking of it that way somewhere in the renovation, across from a man I loved, asking him actual questions about actual things, his photography, his 4 years in this town, his plans for the boathouse studio, with a warmth that had nothing performed in it at all. And I understood, watching her, that she had been waiting a very long time for permission to simply be curious about my life instead of carefully incurious about it, and that the permission had cost me 21 years longer to grant than it should have. My father did not come. That part of the story does not have a tidy ending, and I want to be honest about that rather than smoothing it into something it isn't. He sent a card, eventually, months later, brief and awkward, and clearly the product of several drafts. That said less than I might have once needed it to say, and more than I'd expected to ever get from him at all. And I have decided, for now, that it is enough to be going on with, and that some doors take longer to open than others, and some may never open all the way, and that I have stopped organizing my entire life around waiting for any particular door to move. Preston Calloway did buy Maverick that drink, eventually, at the retreat itself, which went forward that autumn on the very property where I'd once laughed at a joke I should have corrected, and I watched Preston apologize to Maverick directly, plainly, without excuse, and watched Maverick accept it with the same careful, generous grace he extended to almost everyone who showed up honestly asking for it. And I thought, watching the two of them shake hands on the same porch where the whole crisis had started, that some rooms really do get to be redeemed, if you're patient enough and honest enough to let them. Denny, the junior associate whose ceiling heights I'd once corrected with more precision than kindness, sent me a card too, unprompted, when word made its way through the office that I'd come out to the leadership team. A short note that said, in essence, that he'd always found me exacting and occasionally frightening, and had never once doubted I was fair, and that he was glad to know the whole of who his boss actually was, and I keep that note in the same drawer as my mother's, because I think they're saying, in their different ways, some version of the same thing, that the fear I'd spent 2 decades organizing my life around had always been larger in my own head than in the actual rooms I was so afraid to enter honestly. We didn't get married that year or the year after. That part of the story, if it comes, will be its own story, and I'm not going to pretend I know yet exactly how it unfolds. But we did, that same autumn, sit on the new half of the dock, the whole thing rebuilt now. No more line between old gray boards and new cedar planking. All of it one continuous, deliberate thing we'd built with our own hands. And Maverick asked me, quiet, almost shy in a way I found unbearably tender, after everything I'd learned about how hard one. His shyness actually was, whether I'd want to actually live here, not 4 hours away with occasional weekends, not a lake house I visited between contracts, but live here, properly, with him. And run the firm's northern projects out of a proper office we'd build onto the house. And let the city version of my life become the smaller, occasional half of a bigger, better life instead of the other way around. Yes, I said, without needing to think about it the way I had thought about nearly everything else in my adult life, without a single spreadsheet or load calculation or careful weighing of professional cost. And I understood, saying it, that this was the first entirely unguarded decision I had made in longer than I could remember, and that it was, without any doubt at all, the best one. I think about that first night often. The note on the kitchen table should have hot water by the time you read this. A stranger who thought carefully about the timing of my arrival before I'd ever known his name, who lit a pilot light for a nephew he'd never met and left before the asking about back wages could become uncomfortable for anyone but himself. I think about the dog getting 15 honest seconds of attention in the dark, the 15 seconds that told me everything true about him before I ever heard his voice. I think about a level held loose in one hand and a photograph of mist over silver water that I still walk past every single morning, framed in the entryway of a house that is, finally, properly, entirely ours. I only came to Cedar Lake to sell a house I never wanted. I found, instead, the one thing I had spent 21 careful years convincing myself I could live without, and I am not, in the end, the kind of man who believes in fate or in things happening exactly the way they're supposed to happen. But I believe now, in a lake that gave me back a summer I thought I'd lost at 9 years old, and in a quiet man on a dock who taught me that the only unforgivable cowardice is the kind you keep choosing after you've already learned better. And in the particular, hard-won, entirely unguarded happiness of finally, fully, at 35 years old, letting myself be seen. Epilogue, 1 year later. I still keep a legal pad on the kitchen table, out of habit more than necessity now, and I still write things down the way I always have, precise, dated, itemized, because some parts of a person don't change just because the life around them finally does. But the lists are different these days. Order more darkroom chemicals before the gallery show in March. Ask Ren about flights for the holidays. Fix the porch step Maverick swears is fine and I swear is not. The Boathouse Studio has a waiting list now. Small gallery owners from 3 counties overcalling to ask if Maverick Reyes is taking new commissions. And I watch him field those calls with the same careful modesty he's always had. Still uncomfortable, I think he always will be a little uncomfortable, being told plainly how good he is, but answering the phone anyway, which is its own kind of quiet, ongoing bravery. I don't think he gives himself enough credit for. We put a bench at the end of the dock last spring, at the exact spot where I first saw him standing with a level in his hand, looking at water he'd loved long before I had any claim on it. And we sit there most evenings when the light does the thing it does over Cedar Lake at the end of a clear day. Gold going to purple, going to that deep. Complete dark that used to feel, to both of us, separately, like something to hide inside of, and now just feels like the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely undramatic shape of a good day ending. I don't know if I believe in the version of this story where everything gets easy just because you finally choose the right thing once. Some days are still hard. Maverick still goes quiet sometimes, in ways I've learned to recognize and give room to rather than push against. Old caution that 4 years of exile taught him and 1 good year with me hasn't fully undone, and probably never entirely will. I still catch myself, occasionally, calculating a room before I've decided to stop calculating it. Some old reflex from 21 years of practice that doesn't disappear just because I've decided it isn't useful anymore. We are, both of us, still exactly the men we were before we met each other, careful and precise and quietly, stubbornly loyal to the things we love once we've finally let ourselves love them. But I drove up a gravel road 18 months ago, expecting paperwork and a quick sale, and instead, I found a man who kept a house standing out of a loyalty nobody had asked him for, and a dog getting 15 honest seconds of attention. In the dark, and a photograph of mist over silver water that I still walk past every single morning on my way out to a boathouse studio we built together with our own hands? I only came to sell the house. I'm very glad now that the house had other plans for me